I have here in front of me a bunch of photographs. They're all pretty old, you can tell, from the sepia tones and the slight blur in the photographs. In the first picture, I can see a young boy, 8 or 9 years old, holding a bright orange model aircraft, complete with a tail and wheels. He's showing it to us, like how kids proudly exhibit their work at a science fair. He's smiling right into the camera. In the other picture, I can see a go kart, a seat, a sturdy steering wheel, and a teenager working on the car's wheels, looking away from the camera.
Yes, so I enjoyed building stuff, cars, planes, all of that, flying them and racing them.
Chetan Maini, who you just heard, has been building and tinkering since he was 9 years old. So, when he went to the University of Michigan, perhaps it wasn't surprising to anyone that he would participate and win a grueling solar car race with a car that he and his team built from scratch.
We had supercomputers from IBM and we had PhDs helping us. We had two satellites that could download weather data and we would analyze it to understand weather patterns because the only variable was weather, right? How much sun energy would I get today? And
So you're
therefore,
predicting how to drive
how
based
would I
on.
drive and what would my cloud pattern and how do I go between that? And then, running simulations at 5 in the morning before you started the race, right? Wherever you stopped during the day, you camped and you had a person who's with you to make sure everything was charged. So the team went a little ahead and camped in the desert, and we would park the car and stay the night there. Early morning, you had to start at 8 again, and they had each team had someone who managed the process to make sure everything was kosher, and you raced. So you were just sort of didn't know where others were. You of course had someone go up and down to see, but you were on this 3,200 kilometer thing where sometimes the distance between gas stations was 300 kilometers, right? So it's open road.
And while Chetan loved combustion engines, winning this race changed something in him and for him.
I think this experience of racing a solar car and crossing the Australian outback, without any oil, was sort of an eye opener. Wow, I can't believe you can do this, right? And this confidence that you were 20-year-olds and you could beat OEMs and come third after Honda.
So, Chetan decided to stay back in the US, in California specifically, to build something in the electric mobility space. The regulations for electric mobility were kinder there. And he went on to build something I'm sure you've heard of.
The response that we have got thus far is that it's unbelievably good. I mean, the way the car looks, it arouses that passion to own a car. And that's really what I was called upon to do. You must want to own it.
So Chetan, this is a customized REVA.
Yeah, this is a customized convertible, and it's really easy to drive. All you do is turn the key on, and you have a lever here that goes forward or reverse, and you're ready to go. There's no clutch or gears. It's
No
automatic.
clutch or gears.
Yes.
Wow.
And then it has a boost mode, which gives you extra power for top speed. The top speed of this one is around 50 miles an hour.
50 miles. You can drive 50 miles in
Yes.
Bangalore?
On the evenings, yes.
Okay.
Chetan Maini built and distributed REVA, India's first electric car, not just in India, but in 24 countries around the world. Then, in 2010, the Mahindra Group acquired a majority stake in REVA. Chetan now had a pioneering product and the resources of one of India's largest business groups. It was still difficult.
But markets do change, people's perceptions do change. You're trying to do many things. You're trying to sell an electric car, which was smaller, right? Which was from a company that didn't have the biggest brand.
There's too many unknowns.
Right? Policy shifted very significantly where subsidies were removed. So cost structures changed dramatically as he launched. And there was a lot and you had also put the infra. Every charge point in everyone's house was installed by us.
But Chetan believed electric mobility was the future. Manufacturing electric vehicles and getting every Indian to use an electric vehicle was his ultimate North Star. By 2015, he stepped down from his role as CEO of REVA and decided to exit the company and the EV space. there was still a myriad of problems: the high cost of vehicles, long refueling times, range anxiety. Instead, Chetan took a long break. And during the break, he figured out that the answer to solving for India's future in electric mobility didn't lie in a new type of electric vehicle or in any one product for that matter. It was something entirely else. And in this episode, Chetan explains the answer. Welcome to First Principles. I'm your host, Rohin Dharmakumar. Let's begin. Chetan, it's great to finally have you on the show. There is this phrase called BaaS, or battery as a service.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very interesting because, the last interview that I did was with Girish Mathrootham, the co-founder and CEO of Freshworks, which is a SaaS, software as a service company. And I still expand SaaS when I speak it in a conversation because I don't assume that everyone understands what SaaS is, right? And now we have BaaS, right? It doesn't flow off the tongue in quite the same way, but it's even more interesting. If software as a service was interesting, battery as a service is, incredibly interesting. You've been in this space for a long while. You've built REVA, which was India's first electric car, all the way back in 2001. The year that actually did my post-graduation. So it actually feels, incredibly prescient to have an electric car way back in 2001. We're all just getting caught on the EV wave right now. Of course, you later partnered with the Mahindra Group, and Anand Mahindra, actually, if I'm not mistaken, called you the godfather of electric mobility movement in India. And then, of course, you moved on from Mahindra Group. Now you're the co-founder and chairman of Sun Mobility. It's not manufacturing EV vehicles, even though it's a space you've been around for long. There's a lot of distance that I want to cover because you've been in this space for so long. But let me start with Sun Mobility. What is Sun Mobility?
Well, thanks for having me here today, Rohan. And having been doing EVs for over 20 years, I started to see a certain set of challenges that existed, be it me selling cars in India or in Europe, right? And clearly, high upfront cost was one of them, right? And that was driven by large batteries, and batteries constitute 40% of the cost of the vehicle. And the second is, this refueling time, right? People were just so used to refueling in a gas station that anything beyond an hour, half an hour, and 20 minutes seemed like eternity, right? The third is a sort of psychological thing and emotional. It was on range anxiety, right? We carry our power banks. We're always thinking about what if I run out of charge, right? And then there's also this, especially more India-centric, is around this battery replacement cost. What if something goes wrong in the future? I'm buying this huge expensive thing. What if technology changes, right? And we often have that where we end up replacing our phones, not because they still got good tech, but because the batteries are bad. So if we had to fundamentally solve these issues, and that's what was curtailing electric mobility, then it was important to rethink a sort of technology and solution that could do that. Removing batteries from electric vehicles made an electric vehicle cheaper than internal combustion engine vehicle. Swapping it in a minute or two addressed both the range anxiety and refueling time.
Could you repeat that? Removing a battery from
an electric vehicle makes it cheaper than any internal combustion engine vehicle, right? So you remove the battery.
Makes what cheaper?
The vehicle, right?
All right.
So all of a sudden,
since that's the majority of the cost.
Exactly. So now if you remove so now you can have an electric vehicles without the batteries that's actually cheaper than, say, a petrol vehicle, right? When you remove the battery management system, the charging system, and sometimes thermal management too. All of that adds cost, right? Now you can get a vehicle that's cheaper, You can sort of swap your batteries in a couple of minutes. Your cost per kilometer is cheaper than fuel. And you continuously get upgrades to technology. You never care about something going bad, right? So in every year or two, you're getting new technologies that you can use. So from a perspective, when we looked at sun mobility.
Sorry, can I interrupt you
Yes.
right there? Because now, I mean, the most obvious reference that I can think of is to software as a service. And software as a service, the concept came about because the underlying logic was that, look, you're a company, you don't need to be buying servers and running them and upgrading them every year and adding licenses. Instead, someone else should be doing that. And they're incentivized to constantly upgrade their own system, so you get the latest and the greatest all the time. So you're just consuming the latest and greatest software as a service. And to some extent, what you're saying is that it's the same with batteries. Why should a consumer buy a battery,
Correct.
which is the most expensive part of the car,
Right.
and which obviously starts losing its capacity over time, and then they have to worry about upgrading and replacing it? What if someone else could own the battery and just provide the battery as a service
Right.
to the consumer?
Yep. And so it's sort of a HaaS and SaaS, hardware as service and software as
Sure.
service, because it has a bunch of software in it and connectivity, but it's also a piece of hardware, right? And it's a piece of upgradable hardware over a period of time. So I think that's the way the tech is different. The second piece was it needs to be, when Uday and I came together as co-founders, it needs to be global and has to be highly impactful. So it needed to be in spaces that were very large. And what we saw is that 2- and 3-wheelers and small 4-wheelers were, 80% of Indian vehicles. And that was similar in markets like South America or Africa or other places. And if we created a solution, then that could be globally scalable and have huge impact on climate. On the other side was buses and trucks, which, although are just 2% of the fleet in India, constitute 50% of the energy and emissions. So the focus is, where do you focus in the space? And it was completely away from cars and personal mobility to shared mobility, 2- and 3-wheelers, and buses and trucks. So I think it was a shift into where to focus in the entire value chain.
What guided you to this focus?
So in these places, I think, is where, if you look at someone who's doing a delivery today on a 2-wheeler or a 3-wheeler or driving passengers in the 3-wheeler, they're making a living out of it, right? And if you can give them a cost savings of around 20 to 30%, where the upfront cost is no higher and the cost per kilometer is cheaper, they're the ones driving a lot and they're going to jump on the bandwagon, right? So you made them go electric much faster. If you're just doing 20, 30 kilometers a day, just going to work and back, maybe it doesn't make as much sense to you and you don't get much revenue, right? It's sort of, in the early days of telephony, you looked at people who gave you the sort of post-paid large amounts. You're now also doing the 300 rupees, 200 rupees prepaid, right? They may not earn as much on that. They earn really on the 1,000 rupee contracts that you look at it. So in a way, you're focusing where the sort of large revenue is, right?
So
which is,
would I be correct if I said that you're focusing essentially on vehicles which operate commercially?
to start off with, yes. And in the 3-wheeler space, that's clearly there. In the small 4-wheeler space, and trucks and buses. In the 2-wheeler space, there's sort of 3 buckets I would look at. One is purely commercial, where we are currently focusing on. The second is a consumer buys a vehicle and uses it for both applications, right? They're kind of using it for personal mobility, but they're also doing maybe some deliveries and stuff. So they kind of want a vehicle that looks good, has all the performance, and it's sort of what I call dual use. It's a very large segment, right? And the third is pure personal mobility. So we think personal mobility is the last stage of our, as we cover. We're focusing on the first area of purely B2B, and the second area, which is sort of consumers who want to use it for both applications, right? When there's enough infrastructure and when everything's in place, we start to see the third segment of personal mobility. Buyers will be very excited about it because it offers the same things, right? It's lower upfront cost, kilometers. But for a consumer who's in the B2C, they need to see a station every kilometer or two. We've achieved every 2 kilometers in Delhi, but we need to be in all those cities before you go to the third space of it, right? So it's a strategic way of how you looked at to do this. So the concept, therefore, was at Sun Mobility that can you create affordable transportation, electric mobility, by rethinking business and technology, right? Can you create something that's ubiquitous, right? Can it be the Android of electric mobility, right? And today we use 1 battery for a scooter, we use 2 for a smaller rickshaw, we use 3 for a larger loader, and we can use 4 for a small 4-wheeler loader.
So they're modularly designed.
Modular. So that means 1 battery, 1 station can cater to 80% of transportation in India. It can work with any OEM platform. It can work with any service provider. And how do you therefore think of this in a much more unique manner, right?
Help me understand that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. How does it work with every OEM provider? Because, and this is where I think this gets really interesting. The way I understand it as a layperson is that batteries used to be highly proprietary to manufacturers. For example, BYD's batteries or Blade Tech is proprietary to it, the way Tesla designs its batteries, the way Ather's batteries are, the way Ola's batteries are. And I'm just using largely consumer brands to illustrate the point. And you're coming and saying that we are designing a cross-platform battery which is modular enough that the same battery can go into a scooter, more of them can go into a car, more of them can go into maybe even a larger car. Help me understand and visualize, how does this happen physically, or how do you envisage that it will happen physically? Because the form factors, I mean, and this is me coming in as a layman and saying, how do the form factors even fit?
Right. So when I started the company, I looked at 100 products across 2 and 3-wheelers, and most 2-wheelers, had space under scooters, had space under their seat, right? And most bikes where the engine would go would have a space for a swappable battery. 3-wheelers, either where the LPG or CNG tank could fit perfectly there, and for the loaders, you could go, below on the chassis. So in a way, we said this sort of form factor could fit probably 80-90% of products. And 20% of products maybe need some minor modifications that an OEM was probably willing to do on that. So we looked at something that would fit there. The second piece is we created this dock, which has a small computer on board. The battery goes into this dock. So think of it as a slot that is designed for your battery. This dock talks to the main vehicle's computer. Now,
this is a retrofit?
A retrofit or as OEM placement, right? And what this does is that as a result of this intercommunication, you're able to have a separate layer of hardware and software. Now, if the OEM says we want the acceleration slightly better, we want this characteristics, we want that, the intermediate software layer gives that to you. And therefore, you can use a standard battery. And an important thing is we came from manufacturing vehicles, right? So we were sort of an OEM for 20 years. So I kind of knew the pain points of an OEM. What would I want if I was an OEM? What would I want? Well, I'd want something that was already tested, was flexible in architecture, allowed me to go to market much faster, reduced my cost. And so I thought from that side, therefore, what should the solutioning be that would make sense for an OEM partner, right? And then came up with a set of technologies that could help accelerate going electric.
Chetan, give me a sense of Sun Mobility. How old are you as an organization?
So we're just 7 years old, very young.
How many employees are there at Sun Mobility?
We are now almost 500 employees.
How are you funded? This is Bangalore. One of the questions that I ask all founders is, what's your valuation? How are you funded? Give us anything that gives us a sense of whether it's revenue, whether it's valuation, etc., that gives us a sense of your scale.
Right. So from a scale point of view, we today have little around 600 plus stations. We do over 1.2 million swaps every month. And we have over 350 million kilometers on our products across the country. We're in a little over 19 cities today, right?
What does this you said 600 odd swapping stations
Yes.
across 19 cities.
Yes.
If you were to kind of plot it on a graph, where are the highest
so our
concentrations?
focus has been NCR and Bangalore. So NCR would be Delhi and all the places around it, Gurgaon, Noida. And there we probably have around 400 plus stations. In the heart of Delhi, we probably have a station every 2 kilometers. Bangalore, we have a little over 100 stations. Then we have stations in the, Tri-City area, which is the Chandigarh area. We have them in Kerala, in a couple of cities. And we're just starting with Hyderabad and Pune and Mumbai.
All right. How is this company funded?
So when we started, Uday and I co-founded this. So both of us put the initial capital in the company. And over a period of time, we had some angel also I would say not angel, more like friends and family after we put in money. And then we've gotten Bosch came in and they invested in us. That was around 2020. And then in around a couple of years ago, Vitol invested $50 million in the company. And so, we had a good amount of capital through the space, right? We also have a debt because we have assets. So we've also, secured over 50 million in debt that we have that we can look at on this front. And we have, a partnership right now for the next round as we take this forward.
Great. Thank you for that. Now, I want to go deeper into what Sun Mobility does. And one of the things that I think many entrepreneurs learn the hard way is that you can be too early with a great idea in a market. And I think I would probably not be too wrong if I said that with REVA, you had a great product, but the time was just not ready for it.
I agree.
Now, so how is it different with battery? Now, I mean, again, I'm going to switch. So I think for this conversation, I'm actually, I'm not pretending. I am actually the layperson because I don't follow this sector all that much. But are you perhaps betting, because the way I look at it, I mean, my colleague Seema today did an article on charging. Now that Tesla is apparently coming to India, and there is this fight between who gets to control the charging standard, where charging stations are getting put, Ather's proprietary charging technology, etc. So there is this one stream of, I think, news and trends, which is charging is going to be more and more ubiquitous. And not only are there going to be charging stations, many of those charging stations are going to charge your vehicle faster and faster. Right? Battery technology, charging technology is going to evolve. You seem to be, to me as a layperson, betting in some ways against that, right? Like, I'm talking about on a trend-wise directional basis, right? You're saying, yes, I completely agree with you when you say that today it's frustrating to kind of wait an hour or 45 minutes, especially if you're a commercial vehicle operator, to charge your battery. But would that be true in, let's say, 5 years, in 6 years, in 7 years? So directionally, what are you betting on today with battery swapping technology?
I think it's a very valid point. First of all, there isn't any, silver bullet here. You would have technologies on overnight charging, slow charging. You would have fast charging, ultra fast charging, which would be sub 1 hour, and you would have, battery swapping, and these will coexist. Depending on the segment you are and the type of requirements you have as a customer, you may choose the right one that works for you. There are going to be clear areas that one is better than the other in certain segments, and there are going to be certain areas that will be a good overlap that both could work for you. And depending on your requirements, you would choose it. Right? So besides the areas that you've talked about, which is what happens if charging time comes down, what happens if the infrastructure, why would I need this? So let's take a step back. What you're actually doing when you talked about your SaaS model, right? The cost of batteries is 40%, right? Now, that's the big issue here, right? So if today someone walks into a showroom and is trying to buy a two-wheeler, right, is buying a good two-wheeler at 1.3, 1.4 lakhs, and
I'm buying a giant battery with wheels.
And a petrol would maybe be one, and one maybe with battery maybe with 80. Now, if they looked identical, had the same performance, same color, what would you choose? So some customers say, I'll still choose a petrol. Some may say, I love the electric, I can charge at home. And the other says, hey, I'm getting this for almost half the cost, and I get upgrades in battery, and I need to drive a lot, and this makes sense for me, right? So you're going to have a coexistence of solutions, right? The upfront cost reduction is one important part. The upgrades to technology that you get over a period of time is another important piece of the parameter. As you start to go and spread yourself outside the city centers, or even cities like Delhi, 80% of people don't have access to sort of a parking garage or something, right? That becomes very difficult, especially when you think of three-wheelers and stuff. They park it wherever they can, right? And therefore, the infrastructure for charging, right, is a big challenge today. When someone comes in and swaps in 2 minutes and goes away, you can see that same real estate space is very effective, right, on this. So to give you an analogy, one of our stations can swap 200 batteries a day, right? So 200 scooters could be powered in one day. Typically, you would use a ratio of 4 scooters to a charger, right? Maybe 5, which means you need space for 40 to 50 scooter parking versus the space taken for 2 scooters when you swap. In a city that needs to go electric and electric at scale, the infra also has to go at that space, right? So you have to have very scalable infra that mimics refueling of a petrol side of it. As batteries get faster to charge, there's still a limit that if it's 1 hour, it's very challenging. If batteries come very fast, say 15 minutes or something, the power needed for them is very high, which makes the station cost very expensive, which increases the battery cost significantly because you've got to cool them. And, in a car, you can have air conditioning, but in scooters and three-wheelers, it's hard to cool your batteries, and it adds a lot of cost, right? And this adds significant sort of expense to the vehicle, right? This is different for cars, and I think that's why it's important to understand that, right? So you just talked about a Tesla, you talked about, any high end of cars like the Hyundai and everything. They can charge at 300 kilowatts of power, right? And they can allow them to do that. But when they drive, they also use 300 kilowatts of power. So the entire electronics is designed for that, right? When you have a three-wheeler, if you're trying to fast charge it, you'll probably need 40 kilowatts. But to drive it, you need 5 to 10 peak power, right? 10 kilowatts, which means the entire system has to be designed around a fast charging, where in a car, because the power is the same, the wiring, everything can be identical. The cooling can be identical.
It's a system problem.
It's a system problem. So as you start to get in small form factors to go faster and faster, you have this problem. You also, a battery at 45 degrees Celsius, right, is half the life as something at 25. Now, if you're in Delhi, you're in the summer, you parked your bike out, the battery starts to heat up, then you charge it, then you drive it, the battery life comes down. When you go to a station, you put the battery in the station, it cools it down to 25 Celsius and maintains it that till you pick it up, right? So it's a system solution of giving finally the customer, besides the range anxiety, refueling, and lower upfront cost, it's also you think about the entire ecosystem. From a country, it's also important.
Sorry, you use the word ecosystem.
Yes.
And that's one of the, I think the fulcrum of how you changed as an entrepreneur between your first stint to the second stint, right?
Yes.
In your first stint with REVA, you were essentially trying to build a vertically integrated product offering all by yourself.
That's correct.
And now what you seem to be doing, it makes no sense for an individual manufacturer to be solving all of these problems. It should be done by someone else. And you're trying to do that at an ecosystem level.
Yes.
What are the challenges of building an ecosystem solution when it looks like virtually everybody that you talk to is trying to solve some part of the problem on their own? Is it really hard to convince OEMs, etc.? Because in some senses, do they feel that if I don't solve these solutions, I'm just going to become a commoditized chassis builder and seller? So what is my USP? So what happens when you go and talk to OEMs? Why do they agree with you? Or what do you kind of convince them of?
You brought up two parts. You brought up about, do they feel like, are they just a chassis maker? I think that's that's very different today. I think the product that faces the customer, that's the brand, right? You know, the leading car company in India for many years had an engine from a different company, right? But nobody ever said that engine was somewhere else, right? And for many years, so it's not necessarily that the brand and that depend, right? I think the early challenges were OEMs weren't sure of the technology, and when they understood our tech, we have over 170 patents and all this stuff together, and we know we've been doing it for 20 years. That gave them confidence around the core technology, that we could meet the requirements. That's very important for an OEM, right? The second is sort of creating a win-win situation with an OEM, right? If you remove the battery, you're still making margin on your vehicle. You're still selling it through there. Your dealer makes this margin. You're probably selling more product because now your price point is lower, right? So you're enhancing that. The stations can be, as a franchisee given to the dealerships. Now, if you had a regular electric vehicle, the dealers don't make too much money after they sell it because you don't have the usual air filters and oil filters and spark plugs and all that changes. So the amount of maintenance needed is much less. How will dealers survive?
You've really thought this through, right? Like the chain
You have
and the
to, right?
ecosystem.
So now you look at the dealer, he gets two things. He's making money on energy every time he swaps. And the second time is probably he's getting 40, 50 customers coming every to swap. Now he can just say, hey, you're due for service, I can do this for you, and cross-sell services. So you have to take them along, right? Our partnership with an oil company, 70% of the petrol today in the country goes to two-wheelers. If that's going to change the next 5 to 7 years, how would that look at? As an oil company in our partnership with Indian Oil, they wanted a solution that was similar to a gas pump. You came in, one side there's petrol, one side there's CNG, the other side there's swapping. They all take around 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes. In fact, swapping is faster sometimes, and off you go. The same real estate space generates that much. And either you have a customer in one or the other. So in many ways, who you thought would actually be, you could change everyone to be being part of a partnership, right? And if you make them everyone win in this, to me, that's the true ecosystem. And it was important for OEMs to realize that the reason they win is that when that stations go for multiple people, then their customers get more access. And when it's on multiple products of different constructs, they're able to have a much better network for their customers. And they're able to lower cost for their customers because it's a network effect, right? If you did it only for yourselves, you won't have that. So these are some of the important things that we did. It did take some time. I mean, today we have around 15 OEMs on our platform. But initially it did take some time because they had to get comfortable. But I think today when they see this and it working, you've crossed that sort of bridge while some are still on the fence.
Since you've worked in this sector for so long and been an entrepreneur in the sector for so long, I also want to ask you some maybe adjacent questions. Because after the last 2 to 3 years where, I think maybe the last 2 years where people felt that, my God, this is the time of pure EVs. We're going to leapfrog from the ICE engine to the EV engine. Now suddenly, for the last 3 to 6 months, the only news that I can see globally is that, Toyota was right. Hybrids are the answer. Consumers are just not ready for full EV transitions. They have range anxiety. Maintenance costs for pure EVs are too high, etc., etc. So now everyone seems to be saying hybrids are the answer. Where is this coming from, and how come no one saw it coming? And is this true that hybrids are the answer? And I, of course, don't imply that they're permanently the answer. This is an ongoing shift, but would we be right in saying that for the next 3 to 5 years, hybrids are where we're going to see a lot more innovation and action?
Hybrids was something of the past, right? They came in the 90s. They have a great transitional solution. You have a engine that's 25% efficient. You have an electric powertrain that's 90. You want to get better mileage, put them two together. The efficiency goes up to 35. You get a 30% improvement. So you get a 30% improvement in mileage. You get improvement in emissions. But when you think of India, we're growing at a space at which we need more absolute changes, right? And a hybrid has all the challenges of an engine and then a few more of the electric. So you
Because
have
you're effectively carrying two
exactly.
kind of
So
technologies in the
complexity is
same
much
vehicle.
higher on this front, right? And from an electric point of view, the life cycle costs today, even with today's petrol, will be lower, right? So you win on cost, you win on sort of maintenance, right? You win in the larger picture of a market like India, where energy security and climate change are very important, and so reducing the emissions much faster is very critical, right? In terms of the growth globally, if you look at the top 3 cars sold globally, right? It used to be electric. Now it's I think number 2 or 3 in the last month, but it was number 1 2 months ago, which means that any car globally, an electric car is number 1. So I have a hard time. If you told me the first 3 were hybrids, I would think differently, right? But no, it's not. The first car has been, and that 3 years ago was probably not even number 20, right? Hybrids, in spite of being there for 20 years, have not ever made that mark that electrics have able to do in the last 3 years, right? The markets.
So you're a leapfrog person. We're going to India
Well, it
as a
is
market.
because, I was there in hybrids, and I think it would have been the right decision in the late 90s and early 2000s, right? It's like you're in India and someone says, do you want to use sort of, analog network or digital? Well, you jumped. India leapfrogged, and we never went through a analog network on our phone. We went digital. There was a period of time where we were ahead of the US in our network, right? So we were fortunate that we came at a point where the maturity of technology was good enough for us to leapfrog, right? It wasn't good enough earlier enough at electrics.
So there are benefits of not being the fastest adopter of a trend. Then you can wait for a trend to catch up and then essentially leapfrog, right?
And also, I think it's the model. It's a market where you are in, right? So clearly, in the 2 and 3 wheelers, it makes a lot of sense. For buses, electrics make a lot of sense, right? Some people on cars, if they want that extra distance and everything, a hybrid still makes sense. But that's not the part of India, right? Or the markets we're looking at. So it's again about, specifically thinking about, these points and, coming to basic principles on that.
All right. I want to switch back, way back, 20 years, maybe even more, when you were doing your undergraduate studies at the University of Michigan. You won a competition to design a solar car along with the team. And then you were, of course, sponsored by General Motors to race this car at the World Solar Challenge. You came third. They say, and I think I have this photo of you next to a poster which says, "Well done, Chetan, hobby to reality." And there's a younger you posing in front of it. Winner GM Sunrace 1990. One of the things that they talk about entrepreneurship is that find something that you're passionate about, and then you'll never have to work another day in your life.
Yeah.
Was this something that you were always passionate about, and have you just essentially not let go of it?
So I was extremely passionate about building stuff, built radios when I was probably 10 years old.
I have photos of you, a 9-year-old you building a model aircraft.
Yes, so I enjoyed building stuff, cars, planes, all of that, flying them and racing them. I was probably very much into racing and probably, combustion engines, to be honest with you, when I in college. And I think this experience of racing a solar car and crossing the Australian outback, without any oil, was sort of an eye-opener. Wow, I can't believe you can do this, right? And this confidence that you were 20-year-olds and you could beat OEMs and come third after Honda, right? None of us had any experience. So this was a space that was new. It was a space that you went back to basic principles. You could think differently. You could innovate and the impact was very high. And,
just for us, what was the distance that
we did 3,200 kilometers from Darwin to Adelaide. Right?
And what are the broad rules?
So you basically start off at Darwin, right? You have a qualifying of, and based on your qualifying, you start at that level. We
No, the
start.
vehicle itself, like, what can you do? Like,
Yeah, so they had a certain amount of the dimensions of the vehicle, maximum dimensions.
Yeah.
The maximum amount of solar panels you could put on it, and the maximum amount you always need a bit battery, right? Because you're not charging it using mains, you're only charging it using solar. A maximum amount of battery you could use. That's it. The rest of it you could innovate completely. So this was pretty high tech, aluminum space frame, aluminum space frames,
so you're trying
carbon
to
Kevlar
solve for
bodies,
aerodynamics,
lightness,
efficiency of the solar cells,
right?
battery.
We had PhDs helping us. We had supercomputers from IBM, and we had PhDs helping us. We had 2 satellites that could download weather data, and we would analyze it to understand weather patterns, because the only variable was weather, right? How much sun energy would I get today? And
So you're
therefore,
predicting how to drive
how
based
would I
on-
drive, and what would my cloud pattern, and how do I go between that, and then running simulations at 5 a.m. before you started the race, right? Wherever you stopped during the day, you camped, and you had a person who's with you to make sure everything was charged. So the team went a little ahead and camped in the desert, and we would park the car and stay the night there. Early morning, you had to start at 8 again, and they had each team had someone who managed the process to make sure everything was kosher, and you raced. So you were just sort of didn't know where others were. You of course had someone go up and down to see, but you were on this 3,200 kilometer thing where sometimes the distance between gas stations was 300 kilometers, right? So it's open road.
I'm going to play back a quote, which is yours. I was a technologist, not an entrepreneur. I love the tech side. A friend had to teach me how to put together a business plan in a spreadsheet so I could go and raise capital. When and how did you start changing and developing the business side of things? Or when did you feel the need that it's not enough to be just a technology-focused builder, but a business-focused entrepreneur as well?
So REVA was done with a team in India and the US. And I was kind of leading the US side. In our family business, we had someone looking at it here. In 97, 98, 2% of all electric cars in California are supposed to be electric. That went away. The entire EV industry went bust. So this is, predates Tesla and everything. But it was a very interesting time, which meant there was no capital anymore. And I realized that if I had to get my vision, that I had to sort of change here. And it was a big shift for me because I had to understand, all of this, come and talk to banks. No one was giving you private equity or VC money in India in those days. If you're in computer services, yes, right, software, but not for hardware and product. And I think it was very interesting. It was really an eye-opener for me to see it from a different pair of eyes. But the vision is more important, and whatever needs to be done, I got to get there. Whoever can help me, I'll talk to them and learn.
What was your method of upskilling yourself rapidly on the business side? Was it meeting people? Was it reading up? Was it something else?
So I think it was a combination, right? Clearly, someone who had done his MBA and was really smart about it, I spent a few days, and he sort of gave me the ABCs of putting a business case together, running a spreadsheet, putting a P&L, putting a business model, looking at understanding costs and everything. So you kind of, as an engineer, kind of knew all of that because it's data, so it was easy, but it was putting it from a different perspective, understood numbers in terms of what they meant. I think that was very helpful for me, right? Also, probably speaking to my mentor and others at that time was very helpful to sort of learn on the business side. And I think it was easier to catch the business part. It was sort of, you got the few things of it, but after that, it was very fundamental in nature. You need to understand.
Directionally, it's easier to catch business coming from the tech side than it is to catch tech coming from
tech,
the business side.
you need to be quite deep. Here, it was sort of, if someone gave you the basics, you could say, I get it, right? And it makes sense. So it was, I think, much easier if I look at getting to some of the tech side.
One of the decisions that or assumptions that you made with REVA was that you were fairly confident, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that a small four-seater electric car that could carry two adults and two children was the perfect size for Indian families. But you would later realize that it wasn't about small cars and efficiency, but instead people want to own bigger cars because it's also a status symbol. Is that true?
So at that point in time, and I think, economies change, people change. So I started doing the research on REVA in 1996. I personally came to Bangalore and I visited 5 banks. I visited different places to talk to customers, and we did a bunch of surveys. And there was a clear theme that, there was a time where you sort of had Maruti 800. I think Zen had just launched or not yet. There was no one else. So everyone's perspective of a big car was actually, an ambassador or this, right? At that point, automatic stood out, right? Easy to drive and park was very important. Low cost of operation was very important. And we started it as a two-seater, and we clearly realized that people wanted space for their 2 kids. So there was a transition area where a young professional, everyone says, I want to go, but I can't afford this sort of thing, and I'd like to use it. So the studies and everything we discussed pointed us to it. We, in fact, got sketches to and talk and actually change some of the design to what people would like. So we did take a lot of that input, right? Now, when we launched, still the cars are very small. It's only much later the cars became much bigger. But even at that point, probably 80 to 90% of the cars sold in the country, maybe 95, were very small cars, right? And that was in 2001 also clearly the picture. I think the aspiration for larger cars started to change as more cars came out, right, and being there. And I think it's more 10 years later that became a bigger thing. But at the early stages, it was not clear that people wanted bigger cars at that point. I'm sure it aspirationally, but markets do change. People's perceptions do change. You're trying to do many things. You're trying to sell an electric car, which was smaller, right? Which was from a company that didn't have the biggest brand.
There's too many unknowns.
Right? Policy shifted very significantly where subsidies were removed. So cost structures changed dramatically as he launched. And there was a lot and you had also put the infra. Every charge point in everyone's house was installed by us, right? Today, you get an electric car, another company comes and installs it, right? Every point we put in every mall in Bangalore or the airport, everything was put with us. So you kind of had to do everything. That's a lot to do when you're the only player, right? Because there was no ecosystem that existed.
I sort of see now, I kind of connect the dots as to why you're focusing much more sharply on the commercial and B2B segment. Because, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it feels like there are things there you can take as granted. Like, for example, if you're operating a two-wheeler or a three-wheeler or a four-wheeler on a commercial basis, you can take it for granted that there is a value of downtime for them, right? Because it's lost money. You can take it for granted that efficiency and speed matter for them. You can take it for granted that cost of operations and cost of purchase really matters for them. So that, as an entrepreneur, allows you to have a certain set of ground rules that are not going to change. Like, for example, with REVA as a consumer product, you went in with a ground rule assumption, assuming that people would want a small car, and then suddenly the market changed and those ground rules were no longer true.
Right.
So in your second attempt to create an ecosystem, you're not only building an ecosystem, I see you as picking a set of things which nobody can say will change rapidly. I can't argue and say that 5 years later, somebody who's running a commercial vehicle will not value speed of turnaround or cost of operations, etc. Right? So you're de-risking yourself from things that might just change very rapidly. Is that correct?
Yes, and 2 more ways. One important part you brought up is cars are highly emotionally driven decisions, right?
In the consumer side,
Yes, very emotionally driven.
but not
right?
on the commercial
right?
side.
You want, the brand, the color, the smell of the seats. So many things play into you when you're there. That's human beings, right? Your decision on the other side is more economically oriented, right? So therefore you have more flexibility here, right? Where sometimes certain great products look great, but some people say I don't like it, right? But on the commercial side, as long as it meets all the requirements and it delivers product and it's there, all right, you don't like the color, that's okay, right? You're okay with it, that decision, right? So I think that is one important,
more logical, more
more
efficient.
logical, more decision making is so it's easier.
Absolutely. We're never going to see electric Hummers on that side because
Right.
obviously it doesn't make sense. But on
Right.
the consumer side, you'll absolutely see that.
I think the other thing is that you're going into every product, every platform. So if OEM product A doesn't do as well, well, maybe OEM product B does. Its scooter category doesn't do as well, the delivery does. And we really saw this during COVID, where our passenger three-wheelers really declined, but our scooter deliveries and goods delivery increased. We're an energy company. If the energy goes to product A or B, we don't care. There's nothing as a certain petrol bunk for a certain OEM. It's common. So when you're an energy company that's looking at energy as a service and battery as a service, you're sort of in a much bigger, broader spectrum versus diversified across products, across OEMs, and across different customer segments. And when you're going with one product and you're hitting it, it could be a great hit, but it could be a miss. And that may also change over a period of time, right? Customer who comes on your platform is with you for 3, 5, 7, 10 years because they've now on with you, right? They're going to buy energy with you, right? They've invested in a vehicle, so they're going to swap with you and be part of there. So you sort of have a customer for life, right? And if they probably move to the next product, you could switch there like your SIM card. I can switch this to the next vehicle. So they could be in a different OEM product, a different class, but they could still be the same energy provider.
I'm sure one of the things that you studied a lot are the format wars.
Yes.
There have been numerous format wars in technology over the years. For instance, VHS versus Betamax, or the 3G, 4G, 5G format wars, etc. And almost always what has happened is it boils down. There are multiple contending players, then it boils down to 2 contending players, and then whichever one wins gets to control and dominate the market. Like, for example, VHS versus Betamax, VHS won, and then it became the de facto standard, right? You said something early on in the interview where you said in the mobility space, it's not going to be a winner takes all market. There's going to be, like, for example, battery swapping will coexist with various forms of charging,
Yes.
which might be proprietary, etc., and stuff like that. So why do you think that this is a market, such a large market, the economies of scale, network effects will not cause it to converge to maybe a couple of formats where 1 or 2 players get to control what the charging infrastructure look like or what the battery infrastructure look like? Or are you hoping that you will be one of those battery infrastructure players that controls a format?
So, on the battery, right, we go from a form factor that fits a small scooter, right, that can go 25 kilometers per hour, to probably a vehicle that can carry 1.7 tons as a small four-wheeler.
On your website, you talk
Yes.
about buses as well.
And that's a different solution, right? That's a robotic solution. But our current manual solution goes across these platforms, right? So in a way, we're coming from a space that we actually fit everything, and we're open to that. There are likely to be a couple more players because the market is so big in India. In addition to new product, there's also 2 million plus e-rickshaws on the road, and they use lead acid batteries, and every 9 months they need to be replaced. So that itself is probably a couple of $1 billion of energy business on an annual basis, right? That's in every city. So more North India than South India, right? So there can be a lot of players within this space that are in different markets, and still it makes business sense. But probably as you look at key players, you're probably right. There are going to be very few of them because you need an OEM buy-in, it takes time. You need a lot of money behind you. You need the right tech. You need the partners, right? Our access with a company like Indian Oil gives us outlets of 35,000 outlets across the country, in addition to other partnerships, right? So these partnership ecosystems are all important as you start to become, a more dominant player on the space. On the charging side, I think it's much easier to standardize, right? Because the battery is going to different vehicle types and power levels, so that's a bit more challenge, and the solutioning may be different. But in the charging, it's a bit more like the USB side of it, right? You can sort of standardize that. And there is already a push on the two-wheelers to standardize it. And there is a couple of standards on the four-wheelers that are now becoming, there were 3 of them open, and now they're coming down to 1 or 2 that we open. So there I think it's easier, which means the business model there is very different because it becomes commodity. Anyone can put it up, get a certain amount of money, and look at it. Battery swapping is slightly more complex, right? You own the asset, right? So it's a lot of things. You have to manage the asset through its life cycle and second life, right? You have to look at these stations that are in real time working. Complexity of the business is significantly higher, and you have to seamlessly integrate and certify with an OEM. So you have to work together with them. You're selling together with them in their dealerships, right? So it's a bit different partnership model versus I'm putting up a charging infrastructure like a USB-C socket and anyone can use. That's very different from here. So each of them are going to have its own sort of models and ways to work.
What are you paranoid about as this kind of technology super cycle plays out? And you've got skin in the game. You've taken a very bold bet, which one could also say is contrarian in many ways. What are the things that you're watching out for? What kind of news, like makes your ears perk up and say, wait, what, etc. So what are you paranoid about?
I am not, to be honest with you, because I think when, it's more a bit of my nature, but also...
What's that? Tell us. When you say it's a bit of your nature, what does that mean?
If there's a challenge, I like to take it head on and solve it. And I don't see them as challenges, I see them as opportunities, right? And so I think when you have a mindset like that, nothing seems to, push you off, right? And numerous times we've seen that over the period. And each of time, when I reflect back, what I saw was a challenge was one of the biggest opportunities for the company, right? When government in India changed regulation 20 years ago or 22 years ago when we launched, we went global because we couldn't survive in India, right? I couldn't make, money, we couldn't just make it. And that made us made a profitable business at that point from REVA, from the export point of view. But I don't think we'd have ever been a global company selling in 24 countries unless we had that. So at that point, yes, I was mad that this happened. But hindsight, it changed it. So if there were enough experiences like this, that when something came on, to me, it was here. It's also important to say that there were certain fundamentals that your learnings incorporated. So the first fundamental is that the business should succeed without subsidies, right? Because I was bitten by that. And subsidies are important to grow a business, but the fundamentals should work without it. So today, when a person can go and buy a three-wheeler without batteries, without subsidy. Because
there's no battery, no FAME subsidy.
Right. So he can buy it without subsidy, get the energy, which is 20% cheaper, and make business sense for themselves and for the company. Why do you say the
energy is 20% cheaper? Oh, you mean like relative
So they had an option to buy, instead of a CNG three-wheeler, an electric three-wheeler. Now, the electric three-wheeler is cheaper than the CNG three-wheeler, the same price, without subsidies, and the cost per kilometer is cheaper. So we've had our first customers do 2 lakh kilometers, and they've saved over 60,000 rupees, or more. So clearly, this was a very important piece of learning. That it took us some time before we even started the company. For a year, I worked only to get this right. From 2016 to 2017, filed my first patents, then started Sun Mobility. So I had to check this box out, that can a model work on this front?
What were those early patents like? In what
They were
areas?
the 2 fundamental patents we have today, one on the battery and 2 on the kind of flexible swapping infrastructure and modularity that we have.
When you say battery, is it is related to
The swapping
the
battery,
mix
the mix of how you put it, the software layers and everything that allows it to be swappable, and the stations. And so we sort of filed these patents even before I started the company. So I spent a year going around the world trying to see where swapping worked, where it didn't work, what technologies were coming out,
All right.
what would be. And then, so it was a lot of work before you started on this. And,
I got
and then,
that. I'm also assuming that in that interregnum, while you were researching, there was also something playing in your mind in terms of I'm not, and you hinted at that also, that you were bitten by like once earlier by, chasing subsidies, and you decided you would not do that again.
Yeah.
Were there other lessons that you learned from REVA that taught you that no, we're not going to make these mistakes again? One of them, I think you've already said, which is
Yes.
build the ecosystem play rather than trying
Right.
to solve everything as a single player.
Right.
Were there any other learnings that you carried from REVA?
I think it was about that I felt that the products, a lot of companies were coming out, and I felt that product will come from multiple companies. And should I focus on one product and one base, or should I focus on something that can impact the whole ecosystem, right? So where do I focus on, right? And I think that was a big shift. And the shift was also on the sort of revenues that you can generate, right? A recurring revenue model, once you get it right, can be very meaningful, right? And it's also being meaningful for the customer and, of course, for the company. And that's very different on the product side of it. So
Was
it
this
was
hard? Because as someone who grew up tinkering and building, and then built a solar car and then built an electric car, suddenly you're going from building very tangible products and things that you can envision and shape and tune to essentially trying to think of a company where honestly there is no one product on the ground, but it's like an ecosystem and you're making a subscription play. It's very diffused compared to what you've done earlier.
Yes and no. I think that today, when you look at our batteries, they have 3 onboard computers. They have tons of telematics. Our station
It's
technology.
a different kind of sexiness.
It's a different. I mean, it's high tech on this area, right? Sometimes you have to do high tech, but simple for the customer, right? But to get a model like this, honestly, it was extremely challenging in many ways, more challenging than building a car, right? To get it right. We're still working on it, but we're close to getting there.
I can imagine, because you're trying to build a product without knowing who all are going to use it. So it has to be extensible and open enough that many other people can adopt it, but all of those people haven't come to you yet and said, yes, we will adopt it, right? So it's like a chicken and egg situation.
It's 2 pieces. It's in a day, we sometimes see a battery in 6 different vehicles. It has to seamlessly work in every vehicle with, software, OTAs done in real time, and managing it. It's not that you've designed a product and the battery, test everything and going. That's easy. But what if this keeps changing, right? We introduced last year a battery that was 45% better. It had to be backward compatible vehicles made 3 years ago and forward compatible and come out from the same station and also linked with regulation. So the amount of authorizations you do, the cloud you use, the analytics you do is at a completely different level. Because you have to, and the expectation from a customer is that, hey, I come there, I got to get my stuff, right?
Yeah.
To make
yeah.
it seamlessly. So it's hugely on tech.
Yeah, I remember, because just to kind of contrast it, I met Tarun of Aether on this podcast, and he gave me the other side of this problem, which is essentially, I'm a deeply product guy. So, if you tell me that I'm going to put somebody else's LCD on my vehicle, I'm going to build that myself, and then once I get into the LCD, then I'm going to build the software, and then I'm going to tweak the battery. And so he was doing this at a vertically aligned stack, and you're essentially trying to do that at a horizontal level across this.
I mean, I've done this, so what happens is easy. But I will tell you, we work very closely with OEMs, and some of the early OEMs, we've helped them in their current vehicles, helping them to integrate it correctly, being a partner to them. And this has helped a lot of them come quickly on the market. So we're beyond just the battery, but we help vehicle integration. We help testing together. We bring our 20 years learning into what we've done to see how that can come through. These help the consumers go to market.
Incentives and
Yeah.
designing the right incentives must be something that you're always thinking about, because you're building in an ecosystem.
Right.
Everyone comes along based on shared incentives, right?
Correct. Yes.
How do you think about incentives when you're designing an ecosystem? Is there any interesting incentive that you've rolled out within the Sun Mobility ecosystem that's really clicked and that, like, few other people do?
So what we recently started, so all our stations earlier used to be owned by us. We started to say, let's franchise this. And honestly, we've got hundreds of requests, deposits for several hundred, right? We've rolled out a few of them. So clearly, sort of creating a sort of franchise
What does
model.
a franchise own? Just the space?
The station. And so they kind of invest as a deposit on the station.
That's
You
a
get
couple of 100 square feet? Or
Yeah,
more?
less than that, right? You
Less,
need
100.
probably, from maybe 10 feet by 8 feet or something like that, right? So it's 80 square feet or less, right?
I've seen a few of your stations in the HSR layout area. In fact, I've seen a couple of those stations just separated by 4 or 5 shops in the middle. And I'm like, how can there be economic sense for? I mean, I'm guessing they exist because there is enough
Correct.
demand in that area.
Right. So yes, you're right. And so one of them is sort of this franchisee model, right? Two, I think you're creating incentives with OEMs, with people who retrofit and others in a way that's aligning together, right? So it is sort of getting all the ecosystem players. And therefore you've dealt with the energy part and the vehicle part. From a fleet part, you're providing them a solution, right? So in addition to the word BaaS that we talked about as battery as service, we also provide mobility as service, where we integrate the vehicle and the energy and data and provide this to fleet operators. So we have over 15,000 vehicles only on mobility as a service, for example. We're probably one of the largest fleet operators in the country, right, on this front. And that is a full solution. So here's a fleet customer who is in turn...
So they just rent the entire vehicle from you?
Yeah, it's a long-term lease, right? But it's not just the vehicle, it's the energy, it's the uptime. So when we found that fleets were crossing 50 to 100 vehicles, they had a very tough time, charging them, managing it. They almost had to become an EV infrastructure company, right? But they didn't know where the delivery was going to happen. The drivers would come and they say there's no charge. A circuit breaker would trip at night. Vehicles weren't operational. Here, they like the fact that everything's included. On a price per month, I get X kilometers, all inclusive, and my cost per delivery is known to me, and there's no challenges.
And it minimizes downtime.
It minimizes downtime, and I can run 3 shifts. I mean, with some of like Amazon Fresh, I think they do 180 kilometers a day, right, with multiple swaps, and you can do this in a city running 16 hours a day. All of this is possible, right? So clearly, this mobility service is enabling sort of fleets to go electric without having to put that cash down up front, but also not worrying about downtime and infra, all the pieces, right? Over time, more and more will be battery as a service only. Mobility service is a good enabler to get people comfortable with the new technology, right? And so
And
they
provides you a certain critical mass.
provides critical mass. You
for
can
your
optimize
batteries.
your solutions much faster, and gets customers used to it. Now, a lot of the customers who are on our mass solution saying, hey, we're comfortable, we use it for a year. We don't mind buying the vehicles today because we know everything works, and we'll just do battery as service, which is great. That's
So it's
the idea.
progressive risk. First, they want to rent it from you and see if you're able to.
Yeah, because
and
they
then
want to make sure it works correctly, right? And now they're seeing a lot and everything, so it's changing, right? Once people are comfortable.
And I think this downtime is an important marker for the transition from, I think, hosted software to SaaS, or charging your own batteries to battery as a service. Because just like in SaaS, once we made the SaaS transition, what we were promised was, whether you're hosting on an AWS or a Google Cloud, what you're promised is uptime.
Right.
So they will say, we will guarantee you SLAs of 99.998%
Right.
uptime, right? So you as a consumer. And what you're also saying is that in the commercial side, downtime is very important, which is why what we as consumers might accept that it's okay, I can spend 45 minutes or an hour and a half to charge, is downtime, which is not acceptable to a commercial operator. So therefore, battery swapping hits that sweet spot very well.
Yes.
Therefore, downtime is one of the biggest things.
Downtime is a very important, both like I said, the upfront costs, the downtime, and are both important. Our downtime is also because of technology. Like something went wrong with your battery or charger in a regular vehicle, you're down. Here you just
you
swap
gotta
the
send
battery.
it to a
Right, you just swap the battery in a minute. So we have emergency service vehicles. If some guys run out of charge sometimes, right? Emergency service vehicles come there and give it to you. We also have, in case there's sort of power cuts or something that happens in a particular station, sometimes happen, they're doing some maintenance work. We have an emergency service vehicle that reaches in 10 minutes with 30 batteries, right? And it works like a regular station. So if a person has come there, imagine if he couldn't charge or she couldn't charge there. Now they still swap in a minute and get away. So you've created this, you address that in a way.
I get that. I must share this very interesting, I think it's not an anecdote, but there is this very famous saying that never underestimate the bandwidth of a truck full of backup tapes hurtling down the highway at 60 kilometers per hour, right? When people talk about bandwidth, and the logic being that imagine a truck full of just backup tapes, but it's transporting that. So in many ways, what you're doing is when there is a downtime, you're essentially carrying electricity to that place in a truck full of batteries.
Correct.
And so you cannot underestimate the importance of the electricity is just getting there, but it's just getting there in a different form.
But the fact is, if you're to charge, it's still an hour, hour and a half, but this is just a minute. So once it's there, you're up and running. So that comfort level is really important for customers. And this will over time also for B2C. While today it's B2B, but if you think about it, at some point,
consumers get slightly more logical about their choices.
Well, let's separate the energy piece. You could still have the same cool-looking vehicle that has battery swapping in it, or a fixed battery in it, or an engine in it, right? I think today the form factors for delivery vehicles are different than the form factors for personal mobility. So you're comparing apples to oranges. But let's say for a second that you had all these vehicles, same acceleration, same top speed, right? Similar looks, and you walked into the showroom, right? And now I say, hey, I have a station every kilometer away. This battery swapping seems pretty cool because people always remember 1% of their journeys and not 99. And 99% of the time, a scooter driver may be doing 40 kilometers. But that 1% was the day they did that extra trip.
That's a range anxiety argument as well, right? Every day you'll travel 50 kilometers, but 500 kilometers is not enough for you in terms of max range.
That's human. It's human personality, right? It's just how we're brought up. We want horses to run fast. Everything has to have that level of us in the human spirit. So now a customer says, hey, but that 1% of the time it doesn't think of 1%. I last month did this, went home, my wife and I went, we dropped the kid, then I had an extra sales call, and I did 100, 110. And if I do 110 means I need 130. 130 means I need the OEM to tell me I have at least 150, right? I discount it down. And then you can get something with 150 and the product price is very high. Now for that 1%, you're buying something much more expensive. But now we know, hey, when I have that issue, I'll just swap it in a minute, right? So that works really well. So there will be also a set of consumers over time on the B2C that will transition across.
Right? I wish you the best of luck on that because I feel that you're going to have the hardest time with the OEMs on the consumer side over time. But I mean, I do want to move on from, we've talked a lot about business, on technology, product, etc. One aspect we haven't talked about is people.
Yeah.
Right? You say you have 5 pillars for Sun Mobility, and one of them is team.
Yeah.
What are you doing differently, or what have you learned about building team and culture in an organization with Sun Mobility?
I think it's been a very different experience than sort of at REVA. And
how?
When I started REVA, technically there weren't people in the country who had ever done electric vehicle, right? So I got very young talent, and I got a few sort of advisors who were ex-head of R&Ds and everything in companies, but they weren't responsible for delivery. They were just responsible for mentoring. So when the kid had a issue, they would go to him and says, how do I do this heat treatment? And honestly, some of these things they never teach you very well in college, right? You really need that good experience, and they would explain them this stuff, and that helped them a lot. But they were responsible for delivery. And I spent probably 30 to 40% of my time on training hands-on with the team, right? I would just be at the shop floor. I would come home every day with a probably soiled shirt, right? And there was a lot of hands-on work to build up a team and lead from the front, but empower them and challenge them, right? And give them sort of impossible tasks to look at it, right? And I think that was very helpful because people really thought out of the box and no idea was kind of thrown out here. Why I'm saying that is because the industry has changed a lot. There's a lot more maturity. People are coming now with a lot more experiences. And so everything there was new. Your marketing was new. Each part was, there was no given way of doing something, right? So the culture there for creation was much younger teams, much more flexibility, and a lot of sort of guidance in a way that allowed them to look at it, right? Today we've grown a lot faster, and we were starting with one employee, right? And you grew the first few years pretty rapidly. And I realized that I think it's important to realize one's strengths and weaknesses, and also one's passion, right?
Can I ask you what those are for you?
Yeah,
strengths and weaknesses and passion.
I find I'm very good in sort of coming up with the idea, the business plan, the technology, the strategy, the funding, and creating the whole structure, right? That's very critical to give the foundation of the vision and the base, not just the vision, but also all the ingredients that can help make this kind of grow. And I think it's a different skill set to grow a business, right? 1 to 10 and 10 to 100 and 100 to 1,000 are different. And I realized that I need to get different people to do the different pieces. And so, a couple of years ago, I brought in a CEO who runs the business, right? And I look at more strategy, I look at more technology, I look at incubating the new businesses that we're talking about. I'm looking at the international with our teams there. But the operational side is bringing that in. So, sometimes as a founder, that's also difficult, right? You found a company, you want to run the whole thing, but actually realizing that you could do something much better than where no one else can do it, but certain things others can do much better than you. And just because you want to have that piece too doesn't mean it's the right thing. And that to me was a big learning as I went through REVA, what excited me and where to draw a sort of organization, right?
Did you burn yourself out at REVA?
There were times, I would say so. But I sort of bounced back. Like if I burned the next day, I was back up and running, and but also, when you're in your 20s and your late 40s, it's a bit different. You're more aware, you're more conscious about this. You kind of sometimes know what's going to, much better prediction of what would happen. So I think here in the early stages was very much like a startup, building a team, working very much hands-on like I did in the REVA days. And then sort of shifting it around to getting a very seasoned professional and working with them. That what is the values of the company? What is the culture that we would like to have? And having them sort of build that out in a way. And possibly no difference in the end goal, but the pathway may be different, and respecting that the pathway can be different as long as we align the main goal. And people think differently. So this appreciation of giving that, bringing more empowerment, bringing in more, professional teams to come in, right? And creating a culture there.
What is the culture, if I may? If you had to describe the culture at Sun Mobility, how would you describe it?
Well, we're a teenager right now, so we've got goods and bads on this front.
Organizations have goods and bads.
I think the hard thing is when you transition from being the small startup where you know everyone and you're talking to them every day in your same space, versus you're not really that large company that's everything system driven. You're in between right now, right? I like to say we have extremely first passionate and dedicated people, right? Who just give their best every day. And, fabulous we're very lucky to have a team like that just, gives their best, right? I think that's the most we can ask, right? I see a lot of entrepreneurial ways of people taking decisions and allowing them flexibility to look at it, right? Integrity is a very important part of our entire way of thinking here, right? And sort of, if it's a problem, it needs to be a problem for everyone. It's not just in your silo, right? So
that's the only way you can design an ecosystem play as well, I suppose.
Right. So trying to have people experience the other sides more, and also learn more is very critical. And sort of creating a learning organization. Every day I ask people, I tell people when they even do induction, on your back of your book, every day, what have you learned? Write it down. End of the year, reflect. You probably got 300 new learnings, right? And if you're not learning, that means walk across, go to some guy in manufacturing, go into other area, learn something new every day. So to me, I think if it's about being entrepreneurial, learning organization, that really is of passionate people who really want to make a difference in a bigger vision of climate change.
Do you have any advice to people when it comes to choosing careers and being successful at them? Whether you're a founder, whether you're a wannabe entrepreneur, a professional entering the EV space or any other sector, like from your own experience, what would you say are the learnings when it comes to being successful and happy as a professional?
So, I've this Ikigai thing has always believed in that you got to be something you're very good at, something you're deeply passionate about it, and something that you can truly be contributing. I think that really fits. And I often ask my team, and once in a while when someone is looking at leaving, I said, listen, if we can make these 3 boxes fit for you, we should stay. If not, you should find something where those 3 do work. Because they don't, it won't work for you personally. And if it doesn't work for you personally, what's going to work for us, right? And there are times when it doesn't. So I think to anyone, it's about them figuring this piece out. And often conversations where employees are looking at a different role, or when founders or others, is sort of trying to understand this from them, right? And then looking at how you advise them, or have a conversation with them around that.